Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to welcome back to our studio today a return visitor who some of you have seen before, Matt Entenza, who led a long distinguished career in the Minnesota legislature, including 8 years as minority leader.
Yeah, it was minority leader and 12 years total in the House of Representatives.
My goodness, that's a long time. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about the subject of protecting democracy, both around the world and, to many of us, very importantly, right here at home in the U.S. So, Matt, thank you for being with us today. For our viewers who may not be too familiar with us, with you, tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you came to become a lawyer and interested in the issue of election monitoring.
Yeah, so I grew up in Worthington, Minnesota, so about 3.5 hours southwest of the Twin Cities.
The turkey capital of the world.
Turkey capital of the world, yep. We have a turkey race right down the middle of Main Street. Yep, the galloping gobbler race. And then came up here to go to McAllister College. Was able to live overseas briefly, got some scholarships. Being a Minnesota kid from a small town was amazing. Was able to get a law degree over at Oxford University, and then came back to Minnesota, to the University of Minnesota, and I've been here for 40 years.
And got a law degree from the U of M Law School, my alma mater as well. Yeah. So today's topic, protecting democracy, one of the ways, when you think about that subject, one of the ways we protect democracy is ensuring free and fair elections. You've actually received some formal educational training in this process of how do we protect democracy, how do we monitor elections. Tell us about your experience in that area.
Well, after I left office, one of the things that makes Minnesota so, just wonderful, we're exceptional in a lot of ways, but one is we are the highest voting participation state in the country. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't know and that we should be very proud about. In the 2020 elections, we had 80% of eligible voters voting. But it should be even higher, and we can talk later about voter registration to get those numbers up even more. But I was always impressed with how well our systems worked in Minnesota, that people who wanted to vote could register on election day. And one of the things that I wanted to do as someone who'd left elected office is work to help just protect democratic institutions, because in a lot of countries, people here in the States take it for granted. A lot of people risk their lives literally to vote. And so I was fortunate to get a scholarship, and I went to Venice, Italy, and the European Union sponsored a UN-sponsored training course on how to be an international election monitor. And so I have done that work now all over the world. There's a lot of us, Republicans, Democrats, other individuals who have experience with American elections, and we join other former office holders and attorneys and judges around the world going to countries that invite us in to help monitor their elections. And it's been a privilege to be a monitor for democracy.
And so during this experience monitoring elections, I think your first experience in this was 2010 when you went to El Salvador. Tell us about that particular election that you monitored.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to go to El Salvador. I've been monitoring elections in Europe, in now Central and South America, and in Africa as well. And one of the commonalities across those is that there's a UN protocol on how elections should be done. And interestingly enough, most countries, El Salvador is one of them, same in Kenya where I did work, and Ukraine, agree to abide by those. That means how ballots are printed, how candidates should be treated, how votes should be counted. Interestingly enough, here in the United States, we don't consistently abide by those UN standards, which is, we have states that make it very hard for people, for example, to vote. We could talk about
which we're going to talk about in more detail later, yeah.
But my experience there was fascinating because there, you had people very low income, many people who couldn't read or write, but they knew they wanted to vote. In many countries, ballots will actually have symbols next to the party's names so that they can recognize who it is they're voting. It'll say, vote for the party with a rooster, or vote for the party with a cow next to their name. It really impressed me and then energized me to do work in other places was seeing how people who had nothing but hope, who had very little, material wealth, but who believed in their country, wanted to participate, and would stand in line for hours in case of El Salvador, in broiling sun, just to get the opportunity to vote. And it really makes you understand the power of democracy and the power of how people want to participate and want to be part of a legitimate system.
And something that sometimes a lot of Americans just take for granted. You mentioned earlier people risking their lives. Some of the regimes where democracy is relatively new, they've previously had dictatorships or authoritarian governments or the military taking over, and that transition from those types of government to regimes that are democratically elected, it's a very important thing.
Yeah, well, and that's where international monitors are important, and many people might not recognize, but former President Jimmy Carter, he did many great things. One of the great things that the Carter Institute for Peace and Justice, which I've had the privilege to do work with, worked with the United Nations and other groups to put together these international protocols. And one of those was that for elections to be free and fair, that outside impartial observers who don't care what the result is, we just care that the people got to make the decision, get to come in and watch. And so, for example, when I was in Kenya in 2017 for the Carter Center, I was in a rural area on the Uganda-Tanzania border. And I remember going to our first voting center, and voting started at 7 a.m. At 6:30, we went to watch the first voting center open up in our area. And there was already a line of 100 people standing in the dark, in the cold, because they were so excited to have the opportunity to vote. And it still gives me shivers just thinking about that, because we literally couldn't see them until we came over a rise, and all of a sudden you saw this huge line of people. And people hunger for the opportunity to participate in their government. And so anything that excludes them and makes it hard for them to do that is something that we as Americans should really, be fighting against.
And part of promoting democracy, it seems, especially the idea when we say pro-democracy, we're not talking about Democratic Party or a particular political party. We're talking about a process, right? Yeah. Protecting free, fair elections. It seems to me, it would seem to most people that it's easy to win an election. I mean, you can accept the results of that. What may be harder for some people is when you lose elections. That's where democratic institutions are really put to the test, isn't it?
Absolutely. In Kenya in 2013, they had an election, and the losing side felt that the election results weren't fair. So this was 4 years before I was there. And literally mass rioting broke out. hundreds of people were killed, thousands of people were injured, homes were burned down and looted, businesses were destroyed, and it was because people had a sense that the election wasn't fair and that one side had manipulated the process against them. And the group of us with the Carter Center were there in 2017 in part to make it clear that that wasn't going to be the case. And former Senator John Kerry, who of course now is our climate ambassador for the U.S., was there to help lead our delegation, as well as leaders from other parts of the country. And it wasn't a perfect election in 2017, but there was very little violence, very little disruption, and instead you had an orderly transition of governments from one to the other. And that's what's most important.
You had the experience of being an election monitor in Ukraine, not just once, but twice, in 2014 and 2019. Tell us briefly about that experience. Ukraine is in the headlines these days, obviously immersed in a war with Vladimir Putin's Russian forces that have invaded the Ukraine and are trying to absorb the Ukraine into Russia. What happened in 2014 and 2019, just briefly?
Well, the situation in Ukraine really is a battle about the soul of, are the people of Ukraine going to be able to have a democratic form of government, or in the case of Vladimir Putin, is a strong man going to be able to basically make outrageous claims and say, we have the right to undo what the people of Ukraine have repeatedly said in free and fair elections, and just roll in with the power of might. So in 2014, you had a government in Ukraine that was very much tilted towards Putin. There were a lot of charges of corruption, and the people literally rose up in what was known as the Maidan Revolution. So it was almost exactly 8 years ago, and people came together. Some of them were shot by the secret police. Ultimately, the president then fled to Russia because—
This was Poroshenko.
This was before
before him.
Before
Okay.
Poroshenko.
Yeah.
And so then in 2014 they held a presidential election, and Poroshenko was elected, and that was the election I was there for. Here, another remarkable thing that I saw in that election, I was in, now it's called Dnipro, then it was called Dnipropetrovsk, an area that actually yesterday was shelled. And an apartment building was destroyed by Russian shelling. Once again, an area in eastern Ukraine, the Russians kept saying these elections aren't legitimate, people shouldn't vote. There were bomb threats at election sites. The Russians had already, using paramilitary forces, taken over two areas, Luhansk and Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine. And there was a real sense of what would people do, and the Russians were literally sponsoring and paying for several political parties. And overwhelmingly, the Ukrainian people in 2014 voted for parties that said, we want Ukraine to be tilted to the West, to work with the European Union, to have open and free markets, and not to be hostile to Russia, but not to feel like we have to be a part of that.
Right. It's interesting, by the way, just as an aside, you may have seen this in the news yesterday, that apparently Vladimir Putin was holding a press conference or some event to put forth the argument that, well, Ukraine has never really existed. Unfortunately for him, there was a map in the background that clearly showed Ukraine on the map. So the argument that Ukraine has never existed as an independent political entity, it's hard to believe, but those are things that happen, I guess. I want to mention a quote to you that I saw recently and get your reaction. Freedom House, on their website, I found this quote, global freedom faces a dire threat. Around the world, the enemies of liberal democracy, a form of self-government in which human rights are recognized and every individual is entitled to equal treatment under the law, are accelerating their attacks. Freedom House goes on to cite a chart showing a number of countries showing a 16-year decline in liberal democratic government around the world. What's your reaction to that?
Well, there's no question that we've seen a rise of nationalist populism. And certain, I would call them the strongmen, authoritarian kind of leaders, promising that if you just give them the power, let them take care of things, that everything will work out. Because the reality is democratic systems can be messy. You have competing parties, competing claims, and it's always easy for strongmen. And through history, we've seen that. I mean, the Mussolinis and the Hitlers and others are the most extreme examples, but there's many of them, and we've had examples of that here in the United States as well.
And that's a good transition, because before we run low on time, we want to shift our focus toward looking at threats to democracy right here at home. You hear about this in the news a lot. What are some of the threats to democracy right here at home in the United States, in Minnesota? What do you see happening here in our own country?
Well, sadly, I do see threats, and I'm really pleased. We've got a great Secretary of State, Steve Simon, in Minnesota. The Minnesota legislature and Governor Walz just passed and signed legislation to make voting even easier. But we've certainly seen cases of, here in Minnesota, mailers going out telling people vote on the wrong day. We've seen cases telling people, oh, you can't vote because if you vote, you might get in trouble if you've had a past criminal conviction. So misleading sorts of information. So it's very scary when you see people try and mislead things. When I was minority leader in the House, we had a situation where an organization wanted to suppress votes on the Indian reservations, and they literally parked cars excuse me, outside of voting booths that looked like unmarked police cars to try and scare people that the police were watching who was voting. Up on the Red Lake Indian Reservation, the tribal police literally went and found these people who were trying to intimidate voters and said, you need to leave our reservation. And they said, oh no, we have a right to be parked out here. Now, the Red Lake Reservation, is governed by the Red Lake Band and those folks. And they said, no, you don't. We have the right to arrest you for these tactics. And those folks skedaddled out and went back to North Dakota.
When I think about attacks on American democracy, the most recent example that I think will come to most people's mind is the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. And there were some extremist elements that were present there, the Proud Boys, the so-called Oath Keepers. Some of these people are now facing the bar of justice as they're being sentenced to lengthy prison terms for offenses they committed that day, attacks on law enforcement officers, attacks on members of Congress and congressional staff. And these types of things seem to be happening more regularly, and much of the motivation, many people have said former President Trump's speech at the Ellipse that day motivated people to storm the Capitol, but you've also seen examples happening in states, haven't we, like in Arizona with Carrie Lake, who lost a gubernatorial race in that state, relatively close, but she lost, and it was reviewed and recounted. These things seem to be happening more frequently, aren't they? And aren't those, when you can't accept the legitimacy of the fact that you have lost an election and that it has been reviewed by courts and by other election officials, that's a threat to our democracy too, isn't it?
It's a huge threat. We, for many years, actually hundreds of years, starting with George Washington, had an understanding that if you were an incumbent, in Washington's case, it's that I shouldn't be here forever. And he said, even though people said you could be reelected until the day you die, he said, you know what? I've done 2 terms, I'm prepared to stand down. And, I've won elections, but I've also lost elections, and it's not fun. But you then have to be able to...
But you accept that. You accept that the will of the people has been expressed.
That's right. So I think it's dangerous. We've entered a political time here, and we're seeing it in other countries as well, too, where these authoritarian, strong figures think that they're stronger by just denying facts and by saying the media's a liar, the media's not telling the truth, there's lots of fraud. The reality is, not just here, but around the world, examples of voter fraud are actually very hard to find. In Minnesota, almost impossible to find. And yet, when these are repeated, some people believe, well, since people are saying it, it must be true.
Well, when they're found, there's, more importantly, there's a case there that is prosecutable, and prosecutors do go after people who commit election fraud, but it's a fraction compared to the millions of Minnesotans, for example, who voted in the 2020 election.
Yeah, and that's why I'm really proud of how in Minnesota what we've said is we're going to expand access. So for example, when you get your driver's license now, you can opt out, but the default is you'll be registered. Because we actually have hundreds of thousands of people who should be able to vote, but who forget to register, don't realize that it's something, and then they wake up on election day and aren't sure that they can register on election day, which I'd remind folks you can register on election day too.
Right.
But it's very important that we've opened that up. We've also made it possible for felons who are no longer serving their term, they're out of prison, they're off what's called papers.
They paid their debt to society.
And that's appropriate because you want to have people be reintroduced back into our civic fold.
Right. Some of the election abuses that come to mind too, going beyond Minnesota, there have been a number of states that have put restrictions on voting hours, restrictions on polling places. One that really jumped out to me a couple of years ago when we heard that Harris County, Texas, which is where the largest, it's the most populous county, it's almost 5 million people, and home to the city of Houston, the biggest city in the state of Texas, that they only had 1 or 2 locations in the entirety of Harris County where you could drop off an absentee ballot. And in Georgia, where they actually passed a law saying you can't hand out a bottle of water to somebody standing in line on a hot day waiting to cast their ballot. These are examples of things that are totally anti-democratic, and I would argue are really un-American to do something like that.
Yeah, this tendency now of winning at all costs, and that we would rather stop people from being able to vote rather than just say, you know what, we want the broadest variety of people, agree or disagree, to be able to vote.
Well, because a key premise of democracy, isn't it that government governs by the consent of the governed? That's the American ideal.
Yeah, so it frightens me when I see states restricting polling hours, restricting the number of polls, not having enough machines.
Radical gerrymandering is another way, redrawing legislative districts so that you dilute the power of certain groups of voters. Often people who are minorities or people of color find that their votes are diluted, which affects who gets elected to represent them, everything from city council to state legislature to Congress. Yeah.
One of the things that Minnesotans can be proud of is, we had 2 of the closest recounts in this state of any state.
Yes, we did.
In 2008, 2009, Al Franken, when he was elected over Norm Coleman, the state Supreme Court stepped in, as they should. They hand counted ballots because we had the ballots available so they could see the ones that were in dispute. And then a couple years later, when Mark Dayton was running against now Congressman
Tom Emmer.
Right. And likewise, the same sort of thing just a few years later. And both former Senator Coleman and now Congressman Emmer both get credit because they accepted the result.
Right.
And
even though I'm sure they were disappointed, but they accepted that process because it really seems that's going to be the only way our democracy survives.
Yeah. And when I see, for example, in Hungary, the President Orban, in Brazil, he was just voted out but refused to accept the results. But President Bolsonaro, or you see countries like Russia, Putin in theory is elected, but in reality those are sham elections because other individuals who want to run for office are literally told you can't be on the ballot.
Right. And there are some other examples too. One thinks of Erdogan in Turkey too, where they're going through a runoff process where it looks like he very well may prevail in that election too. But this tendency toward thinking that strong men are somehow going to save us all from the problems that we have, both real and imagined, it's very concerning.
Yeah, and that's where I think Minnesota can serve as an example of how positively things can work and our leadership in the number of people voting. And Minnesotans can be involved in this as well, too. One of the things that we always need is we need people to volunteer to be election judges. You actually get paid for that. You don't get paid a lot, but you get paid something. And as many people know, they wonder, well, why does it look like mostly retirees when you go and vote? Well, it's because those are people who volunteer. My stepson, when he turned 18, went and was a volunteer, and he still talks about what a great experience it was. So I really want to encourage people to do that and to recognize maybe you're not going to be an election observer in Ukraine like I was, but you could be an election observer
right here
as a judge, and you'll be trained, and you'll help to make sure
in your own precinct, among your own neighbors that you live around. It's a great thing, and it always moves me. Election day, I'm one of these folks who, if I'm in Minnesota, I'm going to vote in person. And I love that feeling of walking through the door and seeing those election officials and the judges. You have Republican and Democrat judges and others, perhaps independents, who are monitoring these elections to make sure they're secure. So this idea that some people are propagating that, well, nobody's really watching our election process is just simply not true at all. that there are people who are monitoring our elections, not just here in Minnesota, but in every state in the country.
And that's why our participation, when you see that it's, at 80% in the 2020 election, as opposed to, there's other states, particularly in the South, where they make it very hard for people to register. They have deadlines weeks and weeks prior to the election.
Which is ridiculous. There's no good purpose for that, no good reason.
No, it just means it's suppressing people. And then particularly in areas that have high numbers of diverse populations, people of color, very few voting booths that are available, so people have to stand in line. Those are strategies designed to suppress democracy because people think that it'll get the result that they want. And what it does is delegitimize all of government.
Right.
And we should spend less time worrying about who exactly gets elected and making sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate.
And as you hear people remind, I know we both have friends and neighbors who, they may not like what Governor Walz did or what Amy Klobuchar did or what the legislature did this year. And I always say to them, you can vote them out next time. If you don't like what your elected officials are doing, you have a remedy at the ballot box to elect other people. And that's really it's a cardinal lesson of living in a democracy. But as you pointed out earlier, Matt, too, it depends on citizen participation. Working, first of all, voting, but also working as election monitors themselves in their own communities and helping protect this process so that we can pass it on to our own children and grandchildren.
Yeah, I still think about the people in Mykolaiv. So Mykolaiv is in southern Ukraine. And it's an area literally on the border of the front line right now. And I think of how hard that they fought to have the right to vote, and now they're caught in a war. And I want to make sure we're supporting them and supporting democracy.
Very good. Matt Entenza, thank you so much for your election monitoring work that you've done. It's really a fascinating topic. And thank you for your service in the legislature, too, and continuing to protect democracy. We should also mention you practice law real quickly, representing nonprofits and startup organizations. We're down to 20 seconds, so if anyone's interested, they can check you out on the website, Entenza Law Firm.
Yep, and Entenza.com, it's easy to find.
Thank you for joining us on Access to Democracy, Matt Entenza.
Thank you.